Welcome to our fall study of Richard Swinburne's trilogy on the coherence of theism, the evidence for theism, and faith and reason. So I'm going to begin with a series of lectures on his first book, The Coherence of Theism. The edition that we're reading is the second edition, which was published in 2016. In terms of the overall layout of this trilogy, The Coherence of Theism was written first. The original publication date was in the late 70s. In this lecture, I'm going to begin with Chapter 2, which develops Swinburne's views of how you can determine when a sentence expresses a proposition that is genuinely logically possible. Let's begin at the outset to describe what theism is. For many people, when they think of God, they think of an old painting, such as this one, some dude with some long hair and a beard, and maybe a whole bunch of various creatures with instruments, surrounding them. When you begin to read in theology or some philosophy that discusses theism, you see that God is a spirit, so the relevance of these paintings are somewhat questionable. So Swinburne begins in the introduction by defining what theism is. He says that theism is the doctrine that there is a God in the sense of a being with most of the following properties. Being a person without a body, that is a spirit, present everywhere, that is omnipresent, the creator of the universe, perfectly free, able to do anything, that is omnipotent, knowing all things, that is omniscient, perfectly good, a source of moral obligation, eternal, a necessary being, holy and worthy of worship. There are challenges to this claim that don't have anything to do with looking for evidence. There are a priori challenges to the coherence of theism. Some challenges are directly to its coherence, and as we'll see, some challenges are to the meaningfulness of theism, whether or not it actually expresses a claim. Let's look at the first challenge. This is the incoherence challenge. So I want to look at a specific example that comes from a very influential article written in the early 1950s. It's from J.L. Mackie. Mackie also has a book called The Miracle of Theism, which was published in the early 80s, which is an excellent presentation of a case for atheism. So in this 1954 article, Evil and Omnipotence, Mackie says that here it can be shown not that religious beliefs lack rational support, that is, they aren't supported by the evidence, but it can be shown that they are positively irrational, that the several parts of the essential theological doctrine are inconsistent with one another, so that the theologian can maintain his position as a whole only by a much more extreme rejection of reason than in the former case. So this illustrates the character of incoherence challenges. They're not challenges to show that theism isn't adequately supported by the evidence. They're challenges aimed directly at the content of theism and saying in effect that the content of theism is incoherent. So we can look at towards the end of this article at this one particular passage. So here Mackie says, this leads us to what I call the paradox of omnipotence. Can an omnipotent being make things which he cannot subsequently control? Or what is the practical equivalent to this? Can an omnipotent being make rules which then bind himself? These are practically equivalent because any such rules could be regarded as setting certain things beyond his control, and vice versa. The second of these formulations is relevant to the suggestions that we have already met, that an omnipotent God creates the rules of logic or causal laws and is then bound by them. It is clear that this is a paradox. The questions cannot be answered satisfactorily, either in the affirmative or the negative. If we answer yes, it follows that if God actually makes things which he cannot control, or makes rules which bind himself, he is not omnipotent once he has made them. There are then things which he cannot do. But if we answer no, we are immediately asserting that there are things which he cannot do. That is to say, that he is already not omnipotent. It cannot be replied that the question which sets this paradox is not a proper question. It would make perfectly good sense to say that a human mechanic has made a machine which he cannot control. If there's any difficulty about the question, it lies in the notion of omnipotence itself. So again, here Mackie is presenting an incoherence charge to theism, the thought that there is a being that has the property of omnipotence isn't the kind of thing that's amenable to gaining positive evidence in its favor, because on the face of it, it faces these logical difficulties. So let's look at a second challenge. So we had the incoherence challenge. This challenge is going to demonstrate not logical incoherence, but that the content of theism itself is meaningless. Let's go back and look at David Hume. So David Hume, in The Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, says that if we take in our hands any volume of divinity or school metaphysics, for instance, let us ask, does it contain any abstract reasoning concerning quantity or number? No. Does it contain any experimental reasoning concerning matter of fact and existence? No. Commit it then to the flames, for it can contain nothing but sophistry and illusion. This is the famous end of the inquiry where Hume is waxing a little eloquent, but he is applying what's known as Hume's fork, this principle about the cognitive significance of any declarative statement. So Hume describes this principle as follows. This is another famous quote from the inquiry. He says, all the objects of human reason or inquiry may naturally be divided into two kinds, to wit, relations of ideas and matters of fact. Of the first kind are sciences of geometry, algebra, and arithmetic, which are discoverable by the mere operation of thought. Matters of fact, which are the second object of human reason, are not ascertained in the same manner, nor is our evidence of their truth, however great, of a like nature with the foregoing. So Hume's idea here is that you can take any statement, any sentence that appears to state a fact, and you can ask, is it a relation of ideas? Is it similar to logic and geometry and algebra, or is it a statement of fact? And if it's a statement of fact, then you can point to some sense impression that shows that the claim is either true or false. So another way of talking about Hume's fork is to say that every declarative statement is either analytic or synthetic. If it's synthetic, then it's a statement that's comprised of ideas that are less lively copies of sensory impressions. So if we go back and look at the original quote from the inquiry, we can see how Hume would apply this. If you're dealing with some abstract metaphysics or some divinity, and it doesn't contain abstract reasoning, it's not a mere relation of ideas, something that you might think is definitionally true, and it's not referring to some sense experience, then Hume claims that it's meaningless. It's not a genuinely cognitively significant statement. So Hume's empiricism is something that gets developed in the early part of the 20th century by a group of philosophers known as logical positivists. This grows out of the Vienna Circle, which you may have heard about in some of your other philosophy courses. I want to look at a passage from A.J. Ayer's Language, Truth, and Logic, which was originally published in 1936. So in that book, Ayer develops a popular version of what's known as verificationism. Verificationism, as we'll see in a minute, is broadly the idea that a sentence is cognitively significant if and only if it refers to some kind of sense experience. So Ayer, towards the end of the book, is applying this verificationist philosophy, and this is what he says. What is not so generally recognized is that there can be no way of proving that the existence of a God, such as the God of Christianity, is even probable. Yet this is also easily shown. For if the existence of such a God were probable, then the proposition that he existed would be an empirical hypothesis. And in that case, it would be possible to deduce from it and other empirical hypotheses certain experiential propositions which were not deducible from those other hypotheses alone. But Ayer says this is in fact not possible. So Ayer is applying this verificationist view and saying, well, this statement that God exists doesn't have associated with it any verification conditions. And so it can be dismissed as a pseudo-sentence, as a sentence that appears to be making a claim. But then when you look for the supposed verification conditions that would lend this statement credibility or probability, there are no associated verification conditions. So early in the book, Ayer provides a statement of verificationism. He says a sentence has a literal meaning if and only if the proposition it expressed was either analytic or empirically unverifiable. Now, in general, philosophical views often have contemporary defenders. There are not many philosophical claims that don't, in a way, have a enduring appeal to them. So if you're interested in thinking about how broadly a concept empiricist, someone who looks back to Hume and the logical positivist and A.J. Ayres as, in some sense or another, being along the right track, look at, for example, Jesse Prince's relatively recent book, Furnishing the Mind, Concepts and Their Perceptual Basis. This was published in 2002. And there, Prince claims that all human concepts are copies or combinations of perceptual representations. This is something very much like Hume's empiricism. Let's look at Swinburne's response to these challenges, and let's begin with his response to Hume. So the first thing he does is he just updates Hume's principle. So he writes, a sentence is logically possible only if the words designating properties that it contains are the ones of which we have observed instances are defined in terms of such words. Swinburne's first point here is that this states only a necessary condition for logical possibility, and so it can't be used to be shown that a sentence is logically possible. But it has this problem with it that different people may extrapolate from the very same observations to derive different concepts expressed by words with very different senses. Swinburne uses as an example Hume's impression of, say, an 18th century person. So take here this picture of Queen Anne, who ruled at the very beginning of 18th century England. Swinburne claims that there are 4 different ideas that may be associated with Hume's impression of Queen Anne. This is an idea or a concept that is associated with the word person. So it may be applicable to all and only 18th century European humans. So Hume's impression of Queen Anne has a generality to it. It forms the source, the substance, the meaning, right, of a general idea that is applied to all and only 18th century European humans. Or, Swinburne says, it could be that this concept of person is taken to be all and only embodied humans, in which case it would be applied to 19th century humans, 20th century, 1st century humans, and so on. Or it could be applied to all and only embodied rational beings. So perhaps it would be applied to humans, it might be applied to dolphins if they're rational, it might be applied to chimpanzees or baboons, or various science fiction examples, the Alpha Centaurians, for example. Or lastly, the idea associated with person may be applied to all and only rational beings, in which case it has a much wider range of application. And then Swinburne notes how this intersects with the logical possibility of certain sentences. So take, for example, the sentence that there's a person who does not have any body as a part. Is that logically possible? Well, it's not logically possible if the idea associated with person is either the idea in 1, or the idea in 2, or the idea in 3. But it is logically possible in the idea with 4. So one way to get at the problem here is that there's no rule for the uniqueness of an idea and how that is associated with an impression. And of course, that's going to determine whether a sentence is logically possible. So then next, Swinburne turns to the challenge of verificationism posed, as we saw, by A.J. Ayres. So remember, this is the idea that a sentence is meaningful if and only if it can be confirmed or disconfirmed by an observation sentence. There are 2 sentences that appear to be logically possible and hence meaningful, but cannot be confirmed or disconfirmed by any observation sentence. So take Zombie, for example. So Zombie says that there's a being, like humans, in his behavior, physiology, and history, and this being has no thoughts, feelings, or sensation. There's nothing it's like to be this being. That seems logically possible, but it can't be confirmed or disconfirmed by any observation sentence. Or take Toy Story. Some toys dance and play when no one is watching. This has no observation sentence associated with it, and it can't be confirmed or disconfirmed because the toys, of course, are perfect, and that they'll never allow any individual to see them dance and play. the general lesson here is that for a sentence to be meaningful, it has truth conditions. But it doesn't require that those truth conditions are such that an individual has to be able to recognize those truth conditions. We can think more generally about statements that are meaningful in virtue of the fact that they are true and false in certain circumstances, and it may be that those circumstances are ones in which we will never be able to know whether or not they obtain. So how can we tell when a sentence is indeed logically possible? Swinburne discusses three ways. There's the direct way, there's the semi-direct way, and then there are various inductive methods that can be used. So the direct way is an a priori way via entailment. So the idea here is that a sentence is logically possible when it follows from a distinct sentence that's logically possible. So Swinburne here gives a good illustration of this. Is it logically possible that there's more than one space? So it's helpful here to be clear about what a space is and what it would mean for there to be more than one space. So space, Swinburne says, is a collection of places at some distance and some direction from one another. So there's a measure that you can say such and such point is this far away from that point and in certain direction and so on. There would be two spaces if there were two collections of places, members of each collection being at some distance in some direction from the other, but not at any distance in any direction from any member of the other collection. So the idea is that, right, there's a measure on one space and there's another measure on another space, but there's no common measure between the two spaces. Swinburne thinks that this could be illustrated by the apparent logical possibility of Narnia. So in these stories, Lucy enters a wardrobe, which is a portal to Narnia. And when she walks through the wardrobe, she's in a different land that has no distance from England. Now, Swinburne does observe that this can get controversial very quick. So I encourage you to read this particular discussion on pages 26 to 27. The point there is that debates can get very complicated very quickly whether or not a sentence is indeed logically possible. This is why we need other ways to try to determine the logical possibility of sentences. A second way in which Swinburne thinks you can discover the logical possibility of sentence is what he calls the semi-direct way. It's another a priori way via reflective equilibrium. Reflective equilibrium is a method that was popularized in philosophy by Nelson Goodman and John Rawls. And here we have a picture of John Rawls. Swinburne says that the method of reflective equilibrium is a method of discovering the criteria for the wider application of a type of sentence by reflecting on more and more paradigm examples of its correct application. Now we'll see examples of this later in the book. But what is this method of reflective equilibrium? Norman Daniels has a very nice summary of the method in his Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article entitled appropriately Reflective Equilibrium. So Daniels says, the method of reflective equilibrium consists in working back and forth among our considered judgments about particular instances and cases and the principles or rules that we believe govern them, revising any of these elements where necessary in order to achieve an acceptable coherence among them. So the way Swinburne is applying this is that we have intuitions or judgments about the use of words in certain circumstances, and we have syntactic rules and semantic rules, which you can read in the first part of the chapter where he describes what a syntactic rule is and a semantic rule. And the idea here is that you take the core cases and you take the syntactic rules and you take the semantic rules and you try to work out a more general account of those words and the types of sentences in which they occur to try to determine whether or not a sentence is logically possible. So then Daniels continues, I'll pick up where I just left off reading. He says, the method succeeds and we achieve reflective equilibrium when we arrive at an acceptable coherence among the beliefs. An acceptable coherence requires that our beliefs not only be consistent with each other, but that some of these beliefs provide support and provide a best explanation for others. Moreover, in the process, we may not only modify prior beliefs, but add new beliefs as well. We'll see how this works as we continue on in chapters 3, chapters 4, and chapters 5. So Swinburne provides broadly considered a third way to discover logical possibility. These are inductive ways. These are a posteriori ways, ways that you can't discover just by reflecting on the meanings of the terms. So one example he says comes from testimony. So Fermat's last theorem, for example, says that no three positive integers, a, b, and c, satisfy the equation a to the nth power plus b to the nth power equals c to the nth power for any integer value of n greater than 2. So for example, a to the 3 plus b to the 3 equals c to the 3 has no solutions. Now famously, Fermat wrote in the margins of a copy of a text he was working through that he had a surprising proof of this theorem. This intrigued mathematicians for a number of years, and this theorem, Fermat's last theorem, was only proven recently by Andrew Wiles, a mathematician from Princeton University. There's an excellent popular book describing the history of Fermat's last theorem, some of the math behind it, and then Andrew Wiles' amazing accomplishment in the proof of Fermat's last theorem. So the second way that Swinburne thinks we can discover logical possibilities by inference to the best explanation. This is more germane to the purposes of the book, and it's more germane to discovering the logical possibility of certain theological sentences. So in general, Swinburne describes inference to the best explanation as a way in which an explanatory theory is rendered probable by some evidence. So he says this theory, T, is rendered probable by evidence if the following conditions obtain. If one, if the theory is true, then it's probable that the evidence would occur. 2, if the theory is false, it's improbable that the evidence would occur. 3, that the theory fits, coheres with the background evidence, things that we are already committed to, whether general theories, perceptual judgments, and so on. And then 4, the theory is simple. If those conditions obtain, then the theory is rendered probable by the evidence. Now, this is, I think, a very surprising feature of Swinburne's view here, is that you could use inference to the best explanation to show that a certain theory is logically possible. So he says, suppose that using the other methods of determining logical possibility, we can't determine whether T is logically possible or impossible. He then says that inference to the best explanation may show that it's possible. He's thinking of the ways in which scientific theories can suggest very mysterious and surprising facts about the world. So take, for example, the wave-particle duality in contemporary physics. You can go read up about that on Wikipedia, or you can watch some YouTube videos, but it's very strange. There are some interpretations of this wave-particle duality in which these subatomic entities are both waves and particles. That is very strange, but Swinburne thinks that it explains some relevant evidence, such that if the theory were true, it would be probable that we have this evidence, and if the theory is false, it would be improbable that we have the evidence. And the theory fits, in some sense or another, with background evidence, so the theory is true. Now, I will say that this is a huge issue of debate. If you're at all interested in this, read up a little bit on the philosophy of physics. I want to highlight this as a surprising feature of Swinburne's approach here. Okay, so next up is metaphysical possibility.